This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. I am so pleased to welcome Ryan Jenkins to the show today. Ryan's an internationally recognized keynote speaker, virtual trainer, and co-author of Connectable: How Leaders Can Move Teams from Isolated to All In. For a decade, Ryan's helped organizations lessen worker loneliness, create inclusive cultures, and prepare for the future of work. He's also co-founder of LessLonely.com, the premier resource for addressing workplace loneliness, and he earned his BA from Miami University. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Looking forward to this conversation.
So you have a great new book out that is coming to shelves and streams just at the right time, called Connectable, which you co-wrote with Steve Van Cohen. Wondering what led you to write the book, and did you start pre-COVID, or was this a project that started during the pandemic?
The work started pre-COVID. So I've spent a decade speaking and consulting, and my previous book to Connectable was all about Generation Z. So the youngest generation entering the workforce. And as I was doing all the research for that book, I discovered that Gen Z was the loneliest generation. And I found that so troubling and so interesting. And so I started to lean into that to try to figure out why this was occurring and what we could do to help this generation as they step into the work world. And so I began studying loneliness. Then the pandemic happened, and I brought all of this loneliness research to my clients thinking, I don't know, does the market want to talk about loneliness? Because humanity has never wanted to talk about loneliness. But I just wanted to test the waters, and I was floored by the massive appetite. Everyone wanted to talk about it. Even clients that were wanting to talk about generational dynamics, I said, oh, by the way, I'm working on this book. And they just zeroed in on that, thinking that's what we want to talk about. And loneliness was increasing before the pandemic really just put a spotlight on it. And one of the silver linings in all this is that COVID's pulled the curtain back and folks are ready to talk about loneliness. And so we then started studying over 2,000 global workers on their experience with loneliness. And we discovered that 72% of global workers, senior leaders, executives to entry-level folks, 72% of them experience loneliness at least monthly, with 55% saying at least weekly. So it turns out it's not just Gen Z that's lonely. We're all experiencing it. Gen Z is still the loneliest generation, according to our research, but not by much, because again, we all experience it. It's a universal human condition. So to sum it all up, yes, we started pre-COVID, accelerated during COVID, and now we feel like we're excited to broach this topic. We're so glad the book's out there and folks can start having the topic about loneliness, because yes, it's increasing, but that means it's malleable. So what increases can also decrease. And I'm looking forward to talking about some of those solutions today in which we can decrease loneliness.
Yes, so important that you're taking on this topic, coming out right at the precise moment where, like you say, people are finally ready to talk about what might be an uncomfortable topic, but we're all experiencing it to one degree or another. I'd like you to talk a little bit about and share with listeners some of the key themes and strategies that readers can glean from Connectable? And we'll have, of course, the link to the book right in the show notes so people can find it easily.
Yeah, I think one of the standout takeaways from the book and what we hear from audiences and readers is how we're redefining loneliness. So loneliness isn't shameful, it's a signal. It's the first main takeaway. It's not shameful, it's a signal because it's akin to hunger, right? If you have a hunger sensation, then that's a signal that you should go find sustenance and feed yourself. Same thing. If you're experiencing loneliness, that's a signal that you should seek connection. And we, as the human species, we've we're not the strongest species. We're not the fastest. We don't have safeguards. We don't have protective skin or armor. What's made us the most dominant species is our ability to connect with one another, to socially collaborate, and to strategize. And so we've been using social connection. It's been something that's got us to the point where we are now. And in the past, we would be able to pool our resources with our small tribes, and we'd be able to watch each other's backs and strategize on how to take down that woolly mammoth so we could create some warm, fuzzy slippers. And so that hasn't changed. And so that signal in us when we experience loneliness, that is useful because that is a signifier that we need to connect with others. So that's been a key thing. The other is around actually the definition of loneliness. And it's not the absence of people, but it's the absence of connection. And I'm sure your listeners can relate. Sometimes if you found yourself in a crowded room full of people, you can still feel detached and isolated or alone because you don't have a strong connection with those folks. And so that's a big aha for folks, is that it's not about the absence of people, it's the absence of connection. And we take it one step further in the book and really start exploring why work is such a fertile place to create more connections, is because there's so many opportunities to harness and to lean into those connections. So there's connections with your team members and your manager and the organization itself, the culture, the work itself. There's so many different connections that we need to be thinking about. And that if we strengthen, can really keep loneliness at bay, ultimately creating a healthier us and a higher performing team and organization.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes being in a room and feeling alone, room that's crowded with people, is even worse than being in that room by yourself.
Yes.
Because you're looking around
It's
and you're
true.
thinking, everybody seems to be having such a great time except for me, just reinforcing those terrible feelings that we all experience at one point or another. I'm going to ask you for some strategies and some stories that you might have from your research in just a moment, but maybe just to start with this notion of connection, which I'm a huge believer in as well, and completely agree with your point about how we're wired for this as a self-preservation mechanism. How do you and your co-author in the book, how do you describe or how do you define connection?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't think in the book we actually define connection. We certainly define loneliness and workplace loneliness and even belonging. I don't think we quite define connection. So I'm going to give you a loose, off the cuff definition. But I think the idea of connection is really what has your attention. If you feel connected with another individual that you're in a conversation with, you're both have each other's attention. And I think that's one of the most valuable resources on the planet is human attention. You think about why Facebook is, valued at nearly $1 trillion, because they don't mine oil or any other valuable resource. They mine human attention. And so I think that is something we can all feel it, right? If you're in a conversation with somebody, you can feel the presence and the attention that you have of someone else. Or if your work has your full attention or focus, I think that is what kind of helps us to understand what are we actually connected to. And too often, I think there's so many things in our lives now that sever that attention and that divide our attention. And if we really want to lessen loneliness, when is loneliness lessened in ourselves? It's when attention is received, right? When we're able to be fully seen as we are. And so if we want to create a more connection in our families, in our communities, and at work, then I think we have to be much more intentional with our attention. So that would be my loose definition of connection: is where is our attention? Then where do you feel this natural drawn to?
I think that's spot on. Absolutely. And like you said, you can often feel it like this person is, we're engaged, like thinking we're paying attention to each other, responding, and it's a back and forth. And it feels good to be heard and to be seen and to be understood like that. Absolutely. A lot of times people think that facts and data are really what matters when you are, say, in a workplace environment. You're trying to persuade, trying to advocate for, say, a policy that you are developing as part of your organization. And there's a tendency, particularly among folks who are from technical backgrounds, scientists, engineers, again, just in broad strokes, their work really does focus on getting these facts and figures and quantitative measures. And there can be perhaps an over reliance sometimes when on those things, when you are actually having to now verbalize and persuade and advocate for a position that's based upon that information. How do you see connection fitting into that? Why it's so important in maybe the workplace in addition to just the data?
Yeah. So in the book, we respectfully challenge Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm hoping everyone remembers Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He identified 6 needs. It's a pyramid, but it starts with our physiological needs of food, water, shelter. And at the top of the pyramid is self actualization. But right in the middle, he highlights the needs of belonging. And we didn't think that gave the necessary emphasis. There wasn't enough punctuation on belonging there in the middle of that model. So we decided to create a new model, and really we just we boiled down the human needs into 3 aspects. It's live, learn, and link. And it looks like the model looks like a Wi-Fi signal. So the first is live. So you have all those physiological needs, which are urgent that we need to satisfy if we're going to live. Then the second one is learn. So we have this humans have a need to learn new skills. When we were born, we had to learn how to communicate so that we could communicate our needs to our tribe so that we could survive. And then the biggest bar in that Wi-Fi model is link, which is this idea of belonging. And so we argue that while belonging isn't the most urgent need, it is the most significant need. And we tie that to the research of Harvard that Harvard University did. It's the longest study ever done on adult development. It's gone on for over 80 years. I'm sure you're familiar and your listeners are familiar with it. It's gone on for 80 years, which is incredible. Just that alone, that research has gone on that long, that there's been enough funds and there's been enough staff to continue that study, which is incredible. They started with, I think, about 600 or 700 folks. Now they're at over 2,000 folks that they've studied, and they study their lives in very in-depthly, and they trying to figure out what makes for a healthy and long life. And according to the director, the definitive answer for a long and healthy life is quality relationships. So it's about the connections that you have with others. So that's why we put belonging at the top of that Wi-Fi signal as a way to understand that, yeah, it's not the most urgent, but it is our most significant need. That if we aren't feeling connected with others, we are going to turn inward and become ill, sick, and frustrated. And so it is a very dire need. Even if you're an introvert, like I'm sure many of your listeners, I'm an introvert. My co-author is an extrovert. And research after research showed that it doesn't matter. The frequency or the quantity might change between an introvert and extrovert, but this idea of having quality connections in our lives is so very critical.
Really important points. And then, of course, you made the connection between these feelings and physical results and consequences, which I also really believe in.
I just remembered it.
Yeah,
Mark.
go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. So there's a difference between communicating and connection. So back to your question, as far as why is connection so important? We communicate all day, right? We communicate with our body language, via email, text, like we're always communicating, but are we actually connecting? And oftentimes, I think the answer is no, because we're just transacting, we're just pushing around information. And we've all felt this, right, in our personal lives and in other relationships where if we're communicating, but we're not connecting. And so I think if we want to be influential and if we want to persuade folks with the facts and data that you mentioned, we have to establish that connection. And so we can talk about ways to do that later on, but that's why it's really important. And then the last thing I would some of the research that became really stand out in the book was they've done research where they put a group of people through an experience of exclusion.
Mm.
And when that experience of exclusion occurred, their brain lit up. But where their brain lit up was really telling. So the same part of the brain that registers physical pain actually is the same spot that registers when we feel excluded
Mm.
or when we get isolated or excluded or feel alone. And so that becomes really telling too, that if we feel disconnected from a group, from our work, from our community, it's almost as if our body goes into fight and flight mode and we're trying to satisfy that dire need and to quiet that alert that's in our brain before we can then fully show up. And so that's why this becomes such an important conversation. It's not a soft topic, it's a dire one, because if people are feeling isolated and not seen, not connected, then we're just going to continuously pull away from each other, and we're going to be more and more frustrated and alone. And it's loneliness is a spiral downward, and it's a really tricky emotion. So that's why it's important too, is that if we need to nurture these connections so that we can quiet that part in our brain and really fully show up for our team members and for our family members and folks in our community. And so if we don't experience a lot of loneliness ourselves, it's an important conversation to understand the signifiers so that we can reach out and pull folks back into the tribe and into our communities, onto the team, so that we can all stay much more healthy and engaged.
Yeah, I love it. Such an important message. Thanks for underscoring that, Ryan. It really is. It's funny because with new technologies that we have now, some of these kind of expressions like that felt like a slap in the face, what you said, or that felt
Yeah.
like a punch in the gut. It's, there was a reason why that those originally were put together because there was some sort of physical reaction,
Mhm.
you
I've
know.
got a you broke my heart.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
there's this
right,
physical and emotional attachment with that.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. He died of a broken heart. So we're like, yeah, but actually that could be possible. Wow. Yeah, just great. Thanks for raising that. And as far as connecting before you communicate, that's a big mantra of mine too. It's just like you said, people don't like to be told what to do, but if we feel like we're on the same team, then you're not dictating. It's more of a back and forth because we feel respected and heard. Like you said, love it. Really so important. I want to ask you, you've talked about your book coming out right at the perfect time when it's so needed and people are feeling really disconnected in a work from home situation. I just would love for you to elaborate a little bit on this. How can you create authentic feelings of connection with colleagues? And how can leaders effectively connect with their teams so they can form at a high level through a screen doing it this way? And I'm wondering if you have any stories or examples either from your research or your long work in this area.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that we've had this technology to be able to stay connected during these last 2 years. Can you imagine what it would have been like 10, 20 years
Mhm.
ago? We really would have been struggling. It would have been like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know where my team members are or what people are up to." It would have
Mhm.
been really challenging. So I'm so thankful for this technology, and it has been a good in between. And when, in-person connection isn't possible, then certainly this digital environment is helpful and it's valuable. But some of the things that folks can be thinking about, some of the stories that we have in the book revolve around this idea of avoiding 100% work talk. Avoid 100% work talk. What tends to happen with humans when we get together with people, we often go to the most common denominator, what we have most in common, which if we're at work with our colleagues, we defer to work talk.
Mhm.
And we urge folks to go beyond that. And so a couple ways to do that would be we've talked to leaders that would create a Zoom break room, right? A digital break room space, which actually functioned like an actual break room, right? When you go into a break room, you're taking a break. You're not talking about work, and you're more conversing about pop culture, sports, stocks, whatever, personal lives, whatever it might be. And so there was leaders that would actually there would be a standing meeting on their calendar every week where folks could just pop in and out and take a break and just shoot the breeze and connect. So that was one way folks were doing that. Another way folks were doing it is we talked to this one organization, they called it the Inside Scoop. And so once a week in their all hands meeting, they'd spend 5 minutes at the top of each meeting and they'd choose one person to share something non-work related.
Mhm.
And so the one example they gave was this one individual who was often viewed as a very detail oriented person and a great researcher. Well, she shared a picture of her marathon training, and she was actually an Olympic runner and no one knew.
No way.
Like, no one had any idea. And so it's this idea of trying to see the human behind the job. And so now everyone saw this person, not as a great researcher, but now as someone that was extremely dedicated, athletic, so this whole new dimension to that person opened up to folks. And it just took 5 minutes, right? Just these are subtle tweaks we can make. And that's what a lot of our readers and folks that we've been sharing this information with have found very refreshing, is that it doesn't take sweeping, culture changes and you got to convince all these people. It just takes small pro-social behaviors to move the needle when it comes to loneliness and to boost more belonging, connection at work. So those are two examples of how you can do it in a virtual setting.
Yeah, great examples. Thanks for bringing those forward. Ryan, as we wrap up, we had a chance to talk offline about a really interesting distinction that you made about solitude versus loneliness. And many of our listeners experience solitude at work. It might be in the lab or the library, or somewhere else where they're spending a lot of time just by themselves. And loneliness can creep into that and be an unwelcome feeling. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between solitude and loneliness from your perspective?
Yes. So aloneness can lessen loneliness. And so let me unpack that.
Mhm.
So isolation, if you think about isolation, it's not positive nor negative. The negative state of isolation is loneliness. The positive state of isolation is solitude. And again, if we think back to the definition of loneliness, it's not the absence of people, it's the absence of connection. And one of the connections that we all have to nurture is our connection with ourselves. And so the world is so noisy today, and the noisier your world is, the more that should be the more noisier your world is, the bigger of a reason you have to create solitude and to create margin. And so the world's just so busy now. So I think it would behoove all of us to take more intentional solitude. And how we define solitude, it's being free of the input of other minds. So you can experience solitude in a busy coffee shop, right? As long as your thinking is self-directed. And so that's really powerful. And it's really powerful when it comes to leaders or folks that are in positions where they have to go first and they're broaching new territory. And so it's helpful to get folks very comfortable in those settings because, again, aloneness can lessen loneliness. And this idea of solitude is essentially insurance against loneliness, right? If you can find peace with yourself and really nurture that connection, when you do find yourself alone and not intentionally experiencing solitude, you have a bit of a buffer, right? You have some resilience built up to where you can push back against that loneliness.
Just wonderful connection to friends, connection to work colleagues, and connection to yourself. We covered a lot in 25 or so minutes, Mara. This is great. Clearly, you're an expert, not just on the topic, but in conveying it and communicating that. And I know our listeners are going to benefit from that. Ryan Jenkins, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
And listeners, thank you for being along on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.